Talks of David Solomon, podcasts on topics ranging from Jewish history and the Bible to Jewish mysticism, philosophy and thought. To find out about David's talks, books and more, visit davidsolomon.online. And now, here's the lecture.
Tonight we're talking back in the 16th century, and we're talking about a very, very complex time, and tonight's talk is in some ways a complex talk touching on some very fundamental issues. You have to realize that now that we are at the fourth part of this 16th century series, so we have been immersed for a few weeks in the 16th century, and I think that I've touched upon most of the major themes that are going on in the 16th century, so that when we refer back to them, we can do that easily, seeing things in context. However, you should know that my notes, my things fallen down. Not the first time I've heard that this week. Right. Thank you. Let me know if that happens again. It's called microphone dysfunction. You should know that as I'm sure most people who deal professionally or educationally in history and so on have extensive notes on subjects they go into. So even in this four-part delving into Jewish history of the 16th century, there are probably between, say, 25 to 30 individuals that I've looked into over the course of time that I'm not talking about in this series. So when it comes to the last talk, I was always going to put in there people that you're going to be sitting there going, well, why hasn't he spoken about that person? And of the dozens of people that we could look at, I've selected about 9 or 10 to discuss this evening because they are critical, they are crucial, and they really serve to define the 16th century. And it would be almost immoral in completing this overview, if we didn't touch upon their lives, their contributions, their stories. And also that then gives us a deeper picture of the 16th century as well. We always remember that we don't look at people as our starting point of narrative just in order to remember dates and events. What we are really seeking here is the way that people's lives are reflective of the dynamics of history and what is pushing history forward and the contributions that they make to that pushing forward, and just seeing what they're doing in different parts of the world but doing similar things, especially in Jewish history, we gain a real picture of what life was offering, basically, for anyone that was able to climb into the pages of history. There's no internet. And so really the people that we know about from the 16th century on an individual basis, I mean, we can talk about the masses, but those who we know by name, people who from 500 years ago, are those people who for whatever reason managed to make something valuable. Once again, it's often difficult to get into the granularity and the nitty-gritty, but Jewish history affords us that window when we do get an opportunity. The first person I want to talk about, I want to open with tonight, in this kind of list of 9 or 10 who I think we haven't talked about yet but who've made a critical contribution, is an astounding figure and really sits at the absolute cutting edge of the way intellectually, certainly, things are going to change for the world and for the Jewish world. And I spoke last week, when we spoke about women, I started off basically looking at Rome and Ferrara and these places in Italy where the Renaissance was at its absolute peak. And we spoke about how some of the activities that were available for Jewish women in that period were extraordinary compared to other times and places, and to an extent reflected those values of the humanities, the way the humanities was pushing learning and pushing the arts, encouraging men and women to become involved in repurchasing the whole classical project, the neoclassical project. And yet we spoke about that in the context of women, but really we can also say, well, where are the men in that? Where are the men? Are they all either just, in business or in Talmudic study? Is there anyone else whose life is in Italy in the early 16th century very Jewishly reflecting the Renaissance and getting involved in it? And that's a figure that we need to encounter right now, because this figure was born in the second decade of the 16th century and born in Italy to a very, very ancient Italian Jewish family. They had a tradition in their family that they had actually arrived in Italy with Titus 1500 years early on the destruction of the temple. Now, whether or not that's accurate or that was a tradition in their family, very, very famous Italian Jewish family called De Rossi. And the De Rossis, of course, that's an Italianized version of what they were known in Hebrew as Ha'adumim, the red ones. Some people actually interpret that to mean Ha'edomim, meaning that effectively they lived in Rome. And his name is Azaria. And Azaria de Rossi is a very, very complex figure and quite a controversial figure. And sometimes if you mention Azaria de Rossi in certain circles, people start to clench a little bit. But here I think we're going to be relaxed about it. And I'll explain what I mean. Because Azaria was like so many other figures in Jewish history, was a brilliant young man. And he didn't just acquire knowledge in Jewish studies, obviously growing up in that environment, but he was extremely curious and extremely hungry for wider scientific knowledge as it was changing in his day. The first thing that he's going to study on reaching maturity is a profession, and that profession, and this is going to be important because we're going to be discussing this quite a bit this evening, and his chosen profession initially certainly was medicine. The idea that Jews make good doctors was not invented in Melbourne in the 20th century, nor even in New York. It was, in fact, it has been an ancient idea. That is an idea really for two reasons. One is that we keep telling people that we're good doctors, and secondly, that for some reason the non-Jewish world, doesn't matter, the Christian world, the Islamic world, have this perception that you don't want to know much about the Jews, but if you need a doctor, get the Jews. They understand medicine. And so Azaria de Rossi first trained as a physician, but that wasn't really enough for him intellectually, and so he started really delving into anything until he was fluent in numerous languages, became something of a polymath, read up on the science of his day such as it was. And remember, we haven't quite had the scientific revolution yet. It's on its way, and thoughts are changing. So although we've said that the predominant focus of the Renaissance in the late 15th and early 16th century is the humanities, we've also talked about the fact that the humanities didn't see itself as limited to philosophy and literature and the arts. It covered whatever you could know about the world. That then leads on to later in the century, and in the early 17th century, figures like Francis Bacon and so on who'll make that transition. But even in the early 16th, people were starting to develop the types of questions that were going to go on to form the basis of scientific inquiry. And so Azaria de Rossi, living by now in the 1550s, 1560s, is living in Ferrara. And I don't need to tell you what's going on in Ferrara in the 1550s and the 1560s, because we know from last week, Donna Grazia is in Ferrara, and Bienvenita Brabanel is in Ferrara, and there's a lot of things going on in Ferrara. And it really is, and it's kind of a tolerated Jewish community deep within the Papal States that is also benefiting from all the things going on in the Renaissance. I'm telling you that in the middle of the 16th century, if you weren't doing Uga Buga in Tzfat, then the place to be, which we talked about in the second lecture, the place to be was Ferrara. And then at the end of the 1550s, something happened in Ferrara. And so Azaria's sitting there, he's a doctor, he's acquiring all this interesting scientific knowledge, he's become a scholar, he's a very, very brilliant intellect, still curious, and still kind of searching for what his identity is going to be intellectually. He's already by now in his late 40s at least, maybe early 50s, he's still looking for that special something that's going to make him Azaria de Rossi. And then what happens in Ferrara is that there is a horrendous earthquake. Hundreds of people were killed. It just so happened, because he writes about it and we have extensive writings of this, we know about that earthquake in Ferrara, a lot of people talk about it, but Azaria de Rossi also talks about it in one of his books. Because for him it was kind of like a major defining moment. Apart from the fact that it was a horrendous thing to have lived through, when the tremors first started, they were living in a 2-story house. And when the tremors first started, he and his wife ran downstairs to their daughter's bedroom to get her. And as they were standing in their daughter's bedroom, the whole roof of the house collapsed and crashed into their bedroom, which means that had they stayed in that room, they would have been killed. Fortunately, they were saved because they weren't upstairs. They, like everybody else in Ferrara, and you can imagine it's the middle of the 16th century, so it's not like, you're ringing, Vic Power to say what's going on. They grab their family and whatever belongings and everybody. This earthquake, by the way, lasted for days with various tremors and shakes. And during the course of that time, hundreds of people were killed, but most of the city, its population, simply went into the surrounding countryside to wait it out. You didn't want to be near buildings. And they were there for several weeks, the whole population of the city. During the course of which time, people came into contact that would not normally have come into contact with each other, and Azaria de Rossi strikes up a friendship, waiting in the fields outside Ferrara for the city to become safe for the population to return. They're all camping, and after a while it becomes like this great big multi-eclectic camp, and he becomes friends with a Christian priest. And the Christian priest is excited to have the opportunity to meet someone like Azaria de Rossi, even though they both live in Ferrara. It wouldn't normally be an opportunity they would have to converse. And Azaria de Rossi is pretty interested to meet this quite learned priest. And the priest asks him about certain documents, whether they have ever been appeared in Hebrew or in translation, whatever. So they have this dialogue. And as a result of which, Azaria de Rossi then realizes that he's going to embark on a major literary career as a translator and scholar, when he realizes there is so much yet to be done to communicate the basic texts of Jewish thought. But also, as a result of a lot of these conversations he had around this time, Azaria de Rossi realized something about history. And he realized that most of the way in which Jewish sources understood history was according to the historical narrative that had been delivered to the medieval world by the Talmud. Similarly, the scientific picture within Jewish thought of the world was the same picture that was delivered to the medieval world by the Talmud. And in some cases, not only were they not entirely consistently scientific and historical pictures, but in some cases, modern 16th century perspectives on things and discoveries and intellectual discoveries sometimes even kind of conflicted with the Talmud. Azaria de Rossi went on to write a famous book called Me'irat Einayim, which became a very, very controversial book, lauded in some circles in the Jewish world and reviled in others. But the basic tenor of Meirat Einayim is to say that on matters of Jewish spirituality and Jewish law, then who do we have to turn to but the great pillars of the world, the sages of the Talmud? That's a subject that they knew what they were talking about. But in matters of science and history, they were confined to the knowledge of their time. And if rational inquiry and investigation can reveal a more contemporary and renewed understanding of the physical universe, or even of human history and the way things match up in that domain, then we can say that not everything the rabbis said in the Talmud, he never used the word wrong, but is not necessarily literal. Now, when I say that to you, in Glen Eyre in the 21st century, most of you are going to say, yeah, right, duh. But that's not the case then. This was a radical crack in the wall of perception about the relationship between rabbinic statements and reality. The view, by the way, that everything the rabbis say in the Talmud, you know that the Talmud is basically this incredible integration of halachic and what we call Aggadic material. You familiar with that? The Aggadata and the Aggadic material of the Talmud are all the narratives and legends. De Rossi sat down and showed that a lot of those are not really possible to take literally. The rabbis were speaking allegorically, and in other places they were speaking with incorrect scientific knowledge, using a very, very early basic form of modern scientific inquiry. And sometimes their understanding of historical facts didn't really match what we know. Even today in some communities, even in Melbourne, that idea is radical. That idea is heretical. The rabbis were literal. The rabbis knew what they were saying. The rabbis are giving us the history. The rabbis are giving us the science. It's we who don't understand it. But Azaria de Rossi, whose ideas, by the way, of critically looking at Jewish texts critically, don't underestimate what a fundamental shift that is. Within 100 years of Azaria de Rossi, and I know you might have something like, 100 years, but 100 years, 1 century from Azaria de Rossi is Spinoza, who's already applying that method of critical inquiry to the Bible itself. Azaria de Rossi never went there. He just left his notion of critical inquiry to science and history and Aggadic material in the Talmud. The book was so radical that remember talk number 2, right? These are not lectures, these are talks, these are discussions. Remember talk number 2 when we talked about Tzfat? So who's sitting in Tzfat? All the big dudes. And they drew up a decree of, there's different views about what this decree looked like, whether it was in fact, some people think might have thought it was an excommunication against De Rossi himself. Well, I don't think they went as far as that, but it was certainly a decree to call for the Meirat Einayim, his major text, to be burnt. Like just simply, that text should not exist. And a call to all Jewish communities everywhere, if they see that book, to burn it. That's a very, very strong call. And they drew up the decree, and it sat on the desk of no less than Rav Yosef Karo, who we discussed a few times, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, one of the defining figures of the 16th century. It sat on his desk and was to be signed in the morning following the night that he passed away. Yosef Karo died during the night, and that decree was waiting on his desk for him to sign the next morning. He never signed it. The decree was never promulgated. Communities who then heard about this and absorbed that information, most communities therefore did not go ahead and ban the Me'irat Einayim. It was not seen as necessarily something they wanted to get involved with, but they did ban it for anyone under the age of 25. So for centuries, Azaria Dorossi has been one of those, Azaria Dorossi, but a very, very important critical thinker in the whole of the Jewish historical continuum intellectually. It's almost inconceivable to see how you could have Jewish intellectual flow in terms of critical inquiry that moves from the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and certainly the 19th, which is the really big flowering of critical method in Jewish texts, without Azaria Dorossi, and they all refer to him. So very, very important figure. The Rambam never went as far as to say that the knowledge of the rabbis was limited to the science of their day. The Rambam would have tried to reconcile an understanding of the rabbis as having access to higher levels of eternal truth. This was quite a radical departure to say that, I mean, this you got to understand how this argument continues today. It continues today. When opinions from the Talmud are cited in contemporary literature and blog sites or whoever's arguing this, the massive argument about whether the rabbis are only acting according to the science of their day or discussing eternal truths is an ongoing discussion. And we could bring examples about that, particularly in discussions on biology and zoology and so on. They were amazing, the rabbis of the Talmud. Azaria Dorossi is not going to argue with that. No, I'm not going to argue with that. They were amazing. But they were working with the science of their day. Now, one person who had a real problem with Azaria Dorossi and came to the defense of Aggadic material and tried to re-explain the Aggadic material that Azaria Dorossi was critiquing in the light of eternal truths was an astounding figure you have all heard of, but the reason you've all heard of this figure is really one of the minor reasons why this figure is a great figure. And this figure is Rabbi Yehuda Leib, of Prague, otherwise known as the Maharal. I want to tell you something so that I can realign any misperceptions here. The Maharal is not famous because of the Golem. The Golem is famous because it's associated with the Maharal. The Maharal is enormous as a figure. Deep inside the world of Jewish texts and philosophy, the fact that he's attributed with making a golem, which I'll speak about in a few minutes, is kind of like this small side footnote to the massive contribution to Jewish thought and ideas and the towering figure of the Maharal of Prague. And of course, he's living in Prague. And that means that he is in what is then called Bohemia. And Prague is on the rise. It is what they call kind of the golden age of Prague. And Prague is not only is he a great rabbi, and easily, without a doubt, the greatest and holiest and most respected rabbi in all of Bohemia and that in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and that entire area, but the Maharal has developed an entire system of Jewish mystical thought and apprehension out of kind of the very things that interest Azaria de Rossi as well. Now, when I say mysticism, the first thing that we think of is we're going, okay, so the Maharal is born round about 1520 and he dies in 1609. So if he's already developing a deep, systemic, mystical theology, and I'm going to be talking about that in a moment, what are his influences? He's not going to be influenced by Cordovero and Luria, the great thinkers of Tzfat, who we talked about in the second talk, because their works and ideas haven't really reached Prague yet. They're going to, but not really until much later and towards the end of the Maharal's life, and by which time he's already basically outlined his entire worldview. So his sources are really coming from the Zohar, and they're coming from other medieval strands of Jewish thought, Abulafian mysticism, Zoharic mysticism. But when you read the Maharal's works, and the Maharal is encyclopedic, he's got like 18 or 20 major books that outline this view, this worldview, you don't find the same sort of mystically saturated language that you find in openly Zoharically influenced texts. Something is being synthesized here. The Maharal had a view of mysticism that the gems and mysteries and secrets of Jewish thought really should be, in a sense, buried in plain sight, or revealed simply in plain sight, but not in mystical language to say, hello, this is mysticism, but in extremely straightforward and clear language. But without a doubt, just below the surface are some of the deepest mystical ideas to come through. There is a strand of thinkers within Jewish thought that are influenced deeply by mysticism, but you wouldn't know it unless you actually understood the deeper structure of what they're saying. An example of that in the 20th century of someone who was deeply influenced by the Maharal theologically, but also stylistically, for those of you who've been exposed to it, would be Rav Kook. Rav Kook just devoured the Maharal, but also the Maharal influenced quite a significant number of thinkers. Someone who would have been an antecedent of the Maharal in Jewish history, several hundred years earlier, would have been someone like Yehuda Halevi. It is an entirely new way of writing and approaching. It's almost like you're saying, I'm going to give you the whole of Jewish theology, but I'm going to do it from scratch. Amongst the books that the Maharal writes, probably the most powerful, in my opinion, of the ones that I've read, and I haven't read all of the Maharal, but I've been exposed to quite a bit of it, but in terms of texts that one can sit and read and study and become completely absorbed in and amazed, written by him in the 16th century, is a book called Netzach Yisrael. And in Netzach Yisrael, the Maharal, in this deeply influential book that almost every major thinker following the Maharal quotes, in Netzach Yisrael, the Maharal is concerned to understand what is redemption, how can we, and remember, redemption is a very, very big theme of the 16th century, and how can we understand redemption from exile itself? The whole thing begins as a commentary on the day of Tisha B'Av. What is Tisha B'Av? And why does the Talmud tell us that on Tisha B'Av the Messiah is born? It's not the case that we're necessarily waiting around for the great Deus Ex Machina Messiah to come and completely impose a totally new reality. the redemption of the Jewish people, and ultimately, which is ultimately the redemption of the world, the nature of that redemption is somehow found inside the nature of exile itself. These are very, very deep ideas. They are extended across a vast range of thought. But the Maharal is probably amongst the top 5 of the most influential Jewish thinkers. At the same time, he's interested in science. He thinks science is kind of cool. And he fervently wants Jews to understand science so that Jewish thought, in all of its complexity and subtlety, can be applied to the new scientific discoveries, to understand them and to adapt to them. Not adapt to them by changing Jewish law and practice, but to have a deeper understanding of the world, because the more he saw a world that was changing and that would require a new flexibility or a new way of understanding Jewish thought in order to account for these new scientific ideas. And it just so happens that the Maharal is living in Prague in the 1580s, when suddenly not only is Prague on the rise as a commercial, intellectual and artistic centre, but that in fact in the 1580s the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Rudolf II, moves the capital of the Habsburg Empire from Vienna to Prague. So now the Maharal is living in Prague, which is the centre of the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire. And what's more, Rudolf II is kind of interesting. We don't have time to go into just how interesting Rudolf II is, because he was, in fact, in some ways, according to some historians, very interesting. But let's just call him interesting. And Rudolf II himself, unlike any other Holy Roman Emperor before or after him, thought Jews were kind of cool, and he was deeply interested in mystical systems. He set up entire institutions of alchemy. Anyone been to Prague? Yeah. Did you go to the row of the alchemists, which he set up there? It's still a famous street. And for 500 years, that street has been a place where Kafka lived there, right? We're talking, and so we know that there was a meeting in the 1580s. The Maharal was invited to meet Rudolf II, and they discussed Kabbalah, and they discussed Jewish mystical topics, and they discussed the relationship of Jewish thought to science. So the Maharal is that towering figure that also in the 16th century sits on the cusp of the integration between Jewish mystical perceptions and the new scientific revolution that's just around the corner. Therefore, who better to attribute the making of a golem to than the Maharal of Prague? Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that the golem idea or the golem stories or the golem myth, whatever you want to call it, that's attributed to the Maharal of Prague is not true. I would not be so foolish to say that. However, what most historians have noted is that we do not have that tradition prior to the 19th century. So the Maharal was already the Maharal of Prague before somehow in the 19th century this tradition grew that he also made a golem. And while we're on the subject of the golem, let's just touch on some of the famous aspects of the Maharal's golem that I'm sure you're aware of. There are quite a number of golems throughout Jewish history. You are aware of that. He's not the only person that made a golem, but he definitely if he made a golem, he made the most famous golem, and his golem is kind of like the proto-golem, and it's kind of like this humanoid statue that he created using his knowledge of Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, and this thing ran around and did his laundry and killed anti-Semites and did all the things that you need a golem to do. And of course, and then you've got the other sub-stories to that the golem fell in love and was rejected. Really? Is it such a coincidence that this story about the golem of Prague arises precisely at the same time that Mary Shelley is writing Frankenstein's monster? I mean, does no one realize? I mean, so, and of course, the Maharal's golem, the Maharal has to ultimately destroy the golem because the golem's out of control, and then he has to take away the divine name and it collapses in a heap, and then they take the golem's body and they lock it in the attic of the old shul, or the old new shul in Prague, and since then only a few people have been there, and they all return looking like they've seen a ghost, and they go, I can't talk about it. So we don't know, but the Maharal is a figure who's neatly accredited with the golem. Why? Because it presents this absolute synthesis of, on the one hand, Jewish mysticism, and on the other hand, scientific knowledge. And it was still the case in the 16th century, certainly if you'd ask someone like Rudolf II, it was the emperor, it was still the case that Jewish mystical knowledge was actually perceived as potentially containing a type of primordial science, which got a lot of people in the early Enlightenment interested as well in reading Jewish texts, which is why in the next century you'll find Leibniz, you'll find Newton reading Jewish texts precisely because of that idea. And the Maharal is at the forefront of not denying that. I want to move now to a very, very significant figure. I'm aware of the time. I've only spoken about two figures, and we've been going for over half an hour. And I want to make sure we get through these people because they are quite astonishing. The next person I want to talk about is a person called... I'm not drawing a map tonight because you all know where the Ottoman Empire is and you all know where everything is. I mean, if people are confused, I can do it, but give more time to just put these people up. You know that we spoke about all the travels of Jews that were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. Once again, just to reiterate, 1492, big expulsion. Most Jews go to Portugal, but a few tens of thousands try and go elsewhere and so on. Portugal, 4 or 5 years later, does its own expulsion, except this time it doesn't really let Jews go. It just enforces in fact, in many, many ways, the enforced conversion of the Jews of Portugal was even perhaps in some ways more devastating than the expulsion orders from Spain. And so for decades, we're going to look at this. I'll come back to this. But we saw that even from the expulsion of Spain, many Jews went to different parts. And we looked at people that went to Italy and people that went to the Balkans, some people who tried to go to Israel, some people, to get to the Ottoman Empire. And there is one figure who's a young boy who leaves with his father. His father was a very, very respected Jewish doctor in Spain, but that didn't help the expulsion. And he left with his family, and including his son, his young son, and his young son, his name is Moses. And the family name is Hamon. And Moses Hamon, with his father, Dr. Hamon, they made a beeline, as some people did, if you were lucky and smart and perceptive enough. They made a beeline from Spain straight to Constantinople. Bang, let's just go there. It's inevitable. And Moses Hamon is therefore educated by his father in Constantinople, and by the time he's in his mid-20s, no, I would say that's even for this, because that's a little early, but certainly by the time he's in his mid-20s, he's had an amazingly extensive education, particularly in medicine, from his father and also anyone else that wanted to contribute to that project. But by the time he's in his 30s, he is the doctor for Suleiman. He is the Sultan's physician. A Jew, not a converso, not a Muslim, a Spanish Jew has risen to the position, extremely influential and powerful position. People called him the Dr. Prince. Because if you are the physician to the Sultan, you've arrived. And of course, Moshe Hamon utilized that position philanthropically. So he single-handedly, and remember, this is all at the same time that Donna Grazia is coming to the fore and so on. So all of these people are acting in concert, but Moshe Hamon supports an academy of study in Constantinople. He also pays for the construction, maintenance and support of a synagogue in Constantinople. And he starts acting on behalf of Jews and communities right around the Ottoman Empire to present their problems to where he thinks they can be fixed, even if it has to mean going to the Sultan himself. You know, I'll just take your pulse, but by the way, right, there's a Jewish community facing hardship somewhere, or one of your underlings has gone nuts and wants to expel this community or tax this community or do this to this community and so on. For decades, Moshe Hamon was the go-to person. It's almost inevitable that someone like Donna Grazia, with all of the things that she was trying to achieve, would have had to go through either the kiras in the harem, as we discussed last week, or she would have communicated with Moshe Hamon. Just like I spoke in talk number 1 on Yossele Rosheim, who was this great shtadlan, this great representative of Jewish communities in Europe. Moshe Hamon was doing the same thing, except he had a direct main access to the royal family. Now, that is significant because he's a significant person, but there's one thing that Moshe Hamon does in this effort that's amazing from a historical and historically influential point of view. Because at some point in the middle of the 16th century, the Jewish community of Amasya, anyone know where Amasya is? Amasya is very interesting. It's a very, very interesting place. It's in the north of Turkey, and it was always the place where the Sultan was sent as a young man to get educated. And so it started to play a big part in kind of like the political power struggles that were happening in Turkey and in the Ottoman Empire. And Amasya had a Jewish community. Anyway, a non-Jewish man, Christian man, was killed. And the Jews got the blame, and they got the blame as a blood libel. And those of you who've been in talks where I've spoken about blood libel don't need a reminder of what it is. The blood libel, the accusation that Jews take Christian blood, they put it in their matzahs, etc., etc. It was a blood libel. And a number of Jews were tried, tortured, and executed as a result of this. A couple of years later, the guy who was killed turns up. So the entire thing never happened. It's not just the case of, they found out they were innocent. The victim walks into town. That then set off a huge cry. And Moshe Hamon went to Suleiman, he went to the Sultan, and as a result of his influence with the Sultan, the Ottoman Empire issued a decree that no case, which was never issued, or maybe close a little bit in Europe, but never anywhere near a decree like this, that all cases of blood libel against Jewish communities cannot be tried by local courts and local judges. They can only be tried by the royal court. And what is actually inside that proclamation? What is inside that recognition? What is the recognition? The recognition is that the blood libel is ultimately political. It is not a question of regular justice. Jews do not eat Christian blood on Pesach. And if there are Jews that are doing that, then the Jews themselves want to know about that. It is political, something that was realized already in the 16th century inside the Ottoman Empire. Very, very interesting contribution in time. So Moshe Hamon is someone that we need to look at. I also want to touch upon someone I mentioned last week, and this person would be famous even in the context in which I mentioned them last week, but I want to look at them a little deeper, and that, of course, is one of the if you had to go, who's the most interesting character of the 16th century? There's so many, but this guy just might be. If you had to pick one to have dinner with, it might just be Joseph Nassi, Donna Grazia's nephew and son-in-law. Because already by the time he was a young man, like late teenager, early 20s, he's running around basically helping Donna Grazia. And he stays back in Europe as she moves further and further east. Remember, Donna Grazia went first to Antwerp, and then she went to Venice, then she went to Ferrara, and then eventually she went back to Venice, back to Ferrara, and then eventually she went to Constantinople. And Joseph Nassi, clearly one of the most talented and charismatic administrators you could imagine. He must have been, because he always stayed 2 to 3 years. His movements track Donna Grazia, but always 2 to 3 years in delay. He was the one that was responsible for making sure that the Mendes fortune and that the influence that they were having on bringing Jews out of the Iberian Peninsula was all in place. By the time he's 30, he's already done all of that. He doesn't make his way to Constantinople. First of all, he gets stuck in Belgium. He studies at the University of Louvain, and where he also learns, I think medicine and a few other things, but all of that is just a cover while he is operating in the backgrounds. He is really the kind of the secret behind the scenes of what enabled Donna Grazia to be so amazing. Not that he was responsible for her talent, but that he was the other side, the admin side of it, following up everything. He doesn't arrive in Constantinople till 1554. And this Joseph Nassi is out and out a practicing Jew. He is a converso, or like the new Christian, but the law of Moses for him is where his ambition is. So he obviously knows that Donna Grazia is becoming more and more Jewish and more open. But he has to hold it. He doesn't get circumcised until he arrives at the age of 30 in Constantinople. Only by the time he arrives in the Ottoman Empire can Joseph Nassi finally kind of come out. Now, within a few short years, he's already established himself in the Ottoman Empire and in Constantinople, obviously allied with his aunt and his mother-in-law, because remember he married Donna Grazia's daughter, Reina, but he is himself establishing now as a major player. And when Donna Grazia gets the grant for Tiberias, it is Joseph Nassi who goes there to establish it and is appointed by the Sultan under the title of the Lord of Tiberias. The Lord of Tiberias, a cool title. But as you know, the whole Tiberias project didn't quite take off. The whole, let's plant lots of mulberry trees, let's get a silk industry happening here. But if you look at Joseph Nassi's career, especially what I'm about to talk about, you can see a constant striving to do things, on the one hand, not adverse to his own financial benefit, but primarily to assist in the restoration of Jewish and the safety of Jewish communities. And it just so happens that the Sultan likes him. And he's in very, very good favor for most of his career, not maybe towards the end, but for most of his career with the royal household of the Ottoman Empire. And what's interesting about Joseph Nassi is he gets involved in at least 3 different international adventures, if we can call them, political adventures, that kind of changed the world. In a way, the world we live in is the world created by Joseph Nassi. And I'll explain what I mean. One of those adventures, he started a war. He started several wars, and one of the wars he started was a war that the Ottoman Empire had with the Republic of Venice. And that happened between 1570 and 1573. I think it's called the War Between the Ottomans and the Venetians, is like the official title of that war. Joseph Nassi basically started that war, and he got that war going because that war was effectively over Cyprus. That's how Cyprus ended up in the Ottoman Empire eventually by the end of that war. The Venetians lost Cyprus. And it all kicked off because they realized that Joseph Nassi was intriguing with the Jewish community of Famagusta in anticipation of the fact that the Ottoman Empire would take over. When the Tiberias project didn't seem to be taken off, he thought, Cyprus, that could be a good place to get Jews to coming out of Portugal and Spain. Let's get them there. You have to understand how difficult the 16th century was in terms of Portuguese and Spanish Jews, and how important it was to get them out of the Christian world as the Counter-Reformation and the Inquisition were cranking up everywhere. I think although we have a lot to celebrate about the 16th century, there was possibly more crying in the 16th century than at just about any other time in Jewish history. The more stories you read about Jews trying to preserve their Jewish life in the face of this overwhelming Inquisition is phenomenal. Children ripped from their families, people torn apart based on merely simple accusations. We're going to learn about someone in a few minutes that 5-6 years after they took their infant child to the baptism, someone went to the Inquisition and said, after he had the holy water sprinkled on him, I saw him rubbing the child's head with wine to get rid of the stain of baptism. That was enough to have that person burnt. And we're talking about people trying to continue Jewish life and to pass something down to their children. It would be very easy to give up, but very few people actually gave up. It was immense. So you can imagine that the push behind that to try and create these safe havens, but in the attempt to create a safe haven in Cyprus, Joseph Nassi effectively started that war. But it turns out the Ottomans won that war and they gained Cyprus. So all that did was raise Joseph Nassi further in the eyes of the Ottoman emperors, the Ottoman Sultan. The second big international adventure he did was in Poland. He basically meddled in the politics of Poland. He actually was so successful at that to put in place figures in the Kingdom of Poland that would be friendly in commercial terms with the Ottoman Empire, that he was actually granted the monopoly on things like wine and honey coming from Poland and Moldavia and these places. So he becomes even more wealthy, as if the Mendes fortune wasn't already enough. Joseph Nassi becomes very influential. And the third fascinating thing that he did was, historians now realize that it was effectively Joseph Nassi who ultimately, through all sorts of political intrigues, convinced the 17 princes of the Confederacy of the Netherlands to revolt against Spanish rule, which sparked off what then became known as the 80 Years' War, that was only finally finished in the middle of the 17th century with the Union of Utrecht and so on. And that opens up Holland. Without that, you don't have Holland, you don't have capitalism. You don't have stock markets. You don't have explorers who have their adventures underwritten by merchant bankers. You don't have all of the amazing things that came out of Holland's moment in the sun in the 17th century, not to mention all of the intellectual and religious freedoms that Holland started to offer in the 17th century as a result of breaking away from Spanish rule. Now, I'm not saying that Joseph Hanasi is therefore the hero of Dutch independence, but he definitely intrigued and is attributed with basically having kicked that project off by convincing them on behalf of himself and the Ottoman Empire of the merits of that particular manoeuvre. So Joseph Nassi, if you look into Joseph, there's a lot more about Joseph Nassi that we could speak about, but he is, without a doubt, an astonishing figure. And together with Moshe Hamon, these guys are really probably the two most influential communal activists within the realms of the Ottoman Empire, playing international intrigue. But I'm going to just shift focus a little bit, because we spoke about the Inquisition, and we spoke about, so we'll look at the time, we spoke about different things in relation to that. By the way, I know that some of you have noticed that in the 3.5 talks so far, I haven't actually mentioned the most famous Jew of the 16th century. Don't call out. Put up your hand if you know who I mean. Put up your hand if you think you know who I mean. Good, because I'll get to them right at the end, and then by which time you'll have, and then I know that when I say it, you're going to go, oh, of course. It's so there that I didn't think of it. But we'll get there. In the meantime, I want to go to the New World, the Americas. Because what's happening in the Americas? Well, they're exploring, but they're not just exploring. They're colonizing, they're conquering, they're setting things up. Yeah?
Silver.
Silver is one of the big things. Silver, gold. Alles is dort. They got everything there. Oh, yeah, potatoes, tobacco, chocolate. So, the Spanish didn't waste much time, started moving things in there, but of course, things really get going when you get some seriously self-motivated administrators / entrepreneurs going to say, how can we develop a whole new range of economic opportunities and power and expanse and conquest in this new world? And they, of course, became the conquistadors. Oh, it's there. I thought it had fallen. It's there. And the most famous of the conquistadors is? I'm hearing a couple of different names. Cortez. I mean, yes, but, yeah, Cortez is there. And as you know, the Spanish made a rule that, of course, you know, whatever applies in Spain applies in the New World. If the Inquisition applies in Spain, the Inquisition applies in the New World. Moreover, they tried to introduce this kind of law where they said, well, you know, and here's the amazing thing. As I said, history is not just about facts, it's about the mechanics behind the driving of ideas and things. If anything shows that ultimately anti-Semitism is not merely a theological idea, but a racial idea, it is the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, and the whole thing from the expulsion onwards, and the whole of the 16th century trip into that. Because it wasn't enough that Jews had converted en masse and were now officially Christians. They didn't want anybody in the New World that had not been Christian for at least 4 generations. You had to prove that. And as we will see, it didn't stop conversos, even conversos who were secretly keeping, as I said, what they didn't refer to it as Judaism. It was not known as Judaism. It was called, and they weren't accused of Judaism, it was called the Law of Moses. They didn't stop people keeping the Law of Moses in secret from moving to the New World, but for the first few decades, the Spanish didn't have the resources to really apply the Inquisition. And so people were going. Anything to get out of Spain. Can't be worse than here, can it? I mean, whatever's going on there, I'm going to be farther away from Spain. They're going to have to run extra fast to get hold of me. And indeed, as many even non-Jewish historians of the period, the people who were there, the people who were chronicling those early colonies in the north of South America and in Mexico, were telling you that in some places, half the population of some of these early towns were actually filled by conversos, who were in fact secret keepers of the laws of Moses. It wasn't until the late 1520s until the Inquisition kind of got a twinkle of this, and even then they weren't doing anything, but it was too easy for people's enemies to write back to Spain or to write to the authorities and so on. Now Cortés, when Cortés was based in Cuba, and then he basically went into Mexico and started doing the whole thing, and South America and so on. Cortés had a carpenter called Hernando Afonso. Hernando was Cortés's carpenter, but obviously the two got on very, very well, because Hernando was basically given this massive land grant outside Mexico City, and became the main supplier for meat for the whole of the Spanish population of the new town of Mexico City. Became very well to do. Apparently, according to some accounts, even became kind of like almost as fat as the pigs that he was selling. But he became a big supplier and whatever. And obviously, maybe, who knows whether there was economic enmity or whatever was going on. He had Cortés's protection, but Cortés had to go back to Spain on a couple of occasions. And on one of those occasions, they took the opportunity to inform the Inquisition that Hernando, in fact, was a secret observer of the law of Moses. And so that he was brought in. He was in this whole thing happened within weeks. I mean, back in Spain, it would take a couple of years to get you to this point, but within weeks, they brought him in, they tortured him, they elicited some form of confession, and then they burnt him. He died al Kiddush Hashem, and this was the first auto da fe in the new world of a Jew. And what is amazing about that, and I don't want to offend anyone when I say this, but I've got to say it because it's just got to be said. These unbelievably, relentlessly, zealotly close-minded individuals who lauded themselves on this civilization that they were bringing to the Aztecs, and who accused the Aztecs of human sacrifice to the Aztec gods, were taking people like Hernando to the top of these same buildings and burning them to their god. It is exactly what they were doing. And so after Hernando, obviously things changed in Mexico. So much so that if you go just a few years later and you have a figure like Luis de Carvajal, who was a converso, who became the governor of an entire province of Mexico, and was eventually also brought down by accusations that were made to the Inquisition. And eventually they got him on a technicality that he had not told anyone that his sister was a secret observer of the law of Moses. And he was exiled back to Spain, but before he could do that, they stuck him in a jail for about a year and he died there. And he was the first Jew, in fact, kind of like the first European person ever to walk into Texas. The first person who was actually kind of like an out-and-out Jew to turn up in the... Rabbi Groner, have you got those notes there? I just want to have a look at one thing. I just want to make sure I got a name right because for some reason that's bothering me. Yeah, no, we're good. We're good. No, I got it right. It's Hernando Alonso. Hernando Alonso. Some reason I'm thinking Alonso Alfonso, so I'll put a fur, but it's Hernando Alonso. He's remarkable, Hernando, and that whole picture. If we were talking about the next century, we would also talk about these incredibly difficult stories. The Portuguese and the Spanish were awful. And the women that were brought before the Inquisition, as I said last week, it was women that were, in a sense, preserving Jewish life in their homes and so on. But the first Jew in North America is a very interesting chap that I think really qualifies to be one of the most interesting people of the 16th century, if we're talking in this talk. Now that we have an understanding of the basic themes, and he is kind of like the first Jew in what we now call the United States. And his name, and we can only talk briefly about him because I've got time issues, but his name is Joachim Gans. And he's born in like the 15... We're not sure when he's born, actually. We don't even have dates for his born, but we do know where he's from. He is from Prague. He is from Prague, and the first time we pick up Joachim's story is in fact in England. So at some point, probably around in his late 30s, early 40s, he rocks up in England, but he arrives in England with a very special set of skills. Just to show you, to reinforce what I'm talking about, what was going on in Prague, Joachim Gans, who was almost inevitably related to the famous Jewish historian of the 16th century, we don't have time to talk about David Gans, who I actually talked about David Gans in the very, very beginning of the very first talk in this series, when I talked about a guy who was writing a history book that said that he was told by his grandfather about who sold his oven after Pesach in the year of repentance of Asher Lemlein, if you remember that. So Joachim Gans is probably related to that family, but he comes from Prague and he ends up in England, and he is a metallurgist, not an alchemist. He's not like Rudolph II looking for the great philosopher's stone that can turn stuff into gold, but he in fact is a proper scientific metallurgist. So he is working on new techniques to smelt metals, particularly copper and useful metals like that, which they knew how to do, but they were always on the lookout for new techniques, and they were just starting to open up the study of materials. So he created this kind of successful reputation in England. Now, I know what you're saying. England, 1580s, no Jews, David. Well, it just so happened that Joachim Gans was there, and he made it very clear that he wasn't going to get baptized, but he just went under the radar with a very special skill set. But even so, he knew that it would be impossible for him to fully express himself. He can't go around saying, "Hi, I'm a Jew, Christianity is X, Y, Z," whatever. You can't do that. He's not having those discussions, but he's very involved. And what helps him is the fact that he's not in London, he's living in the countryside, and in Cumberland or whatever, but what helps him is the fact that he has this very sought-after skill set. In fact, it's so sought-after skill set that he is recruited by none other than the person who is going to set up the first British colony in North America. You see, the British saw the Portuguese and the Spanish dividing up the world, but by the time you get through the Reformation, and by the time you get through Henry VIII, and by the time you get into Elizabethan England, They don't give a monkey's what the Spanish and the Portuguese want to do. Our destiny is to be England. Our destiny is to be just as great as ours. So we're going to start exploring. We're going to start colonizing. You take South America, Central America, but we'll have North America. Thank you very much. And the first person to set up a colony, you know this from school, the first person to set up a colony in what is now the United States, in North America, was, of course, close but no cigar. Well, Drake's going to come into it. Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh is given by Elizabeth a commission to set up a colony in Virginia. So he puts together his colony and he's going to set it up on Roanoke Island. Anyone know the famous thing about Roanoke Island? What happened to the colony? This is because we grow up in Australia or South Africa or Russia. This apparently, the story of the lost colony of Roanoke Island is, of course, a story that is known by every school child in America, apparently, I'm told. But there is a famous thing about how basically they all went missing and they cut this strange word in the trees before, and when they went to find them, there was no one there. But that was the second attempt. The first attempt was Raleigh himself didn't go. He sent his mate Richard Grenville to go and set up the colony. And they took with them 20 or 30 highly specialised individuals that they thought would be the most useful people to set up this new colony in Virginia. One of them was Joachim Gans. Archaeologists of the Roanoke colony have found Gans's work in copper smelting, but apparently they couldn't get the techniques going. Nothing really worked. They had trouble with the local population, as you can imagine they would. They couldn't get their agriculture going. They couldn't get the thing going. Remember, it was supposed to be economically viable, and they were just on their last legs. I mean, it's quite amazing because when you look at what happened in Sydney, right, you've got to remember that that is 2 centuries later, 2 centuries of scientific development later to set up a remote colony. This is at the end of the 16th century. And so they were really on their last legs, and just when they were about to all, submit themselves for breakfast to the local population, whatever it is, or just go to their huts and die, who turns up? Who sails in just to check on the colony and see what's happening? Sir Francis Drake. So Drake says to them, Raleigh was a bit pissed off by this actually, but Drake said, look, I found these people, I had to offer them. He said, I'm sailing back to England, who wants on? So the entire colony jumped on Drake's boat and they all went back to England. It wasn't for another few years until the British tried again to resettle Roanoke colony, which is the colony that went missing in action. No one knows what happened to it. Gans goes back to England and amazingly doesn't really take up copper smelting anymore, but in fact decides that he will teach Hebrew. So he sets himself up as a Hebrew teacher. So all these kind of intellectuals and open-minded clergymen are coming to Gans. And at one point, oh, by the way, Gans protected himself. He said, I'm going to be this kind of inviolable person. They won't be able to get me, even though I'm not supposed to be a Jew. But here I am, I'm a Jew, I'm teaching Hebrew in England in the 1580s. But it's okay, in the 1590s. I'm going to protect myself because I'm going to write a whole dossier, which I'm going to send to Walsingham and the other people, the intrigues that were going on in the Elizabethan court, an entire scientific treatise and methodology on how to effectively and cheaply create saltpeter. And why is that important? Gunpowder. In a way, Gans is the critical person that opens up for England the ability to create arms and ammunition so that they can eventually go and take on the Spanish. These people, these Jews, they're finding themselves in these unbelievably crucial turning points in Jewish history and in world history. But of course, at some point these ministers say to Gans, why don't you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? And Gans answers, as you would, because God doesn't need a son. And these people go back to England, to the authorities. Gans, by the way, the ruling authority there is going to be the Church of England. It's not going to be, the Catholic Church. But nevertheless, they don't want to hear this sort of thing. And so he was summoned, not as he would have been. A figure like Gans couldn't have existed in Spain in the 16th century anyway, but he wouldn't have been he wasn't brought in as he would have been in the Inquisition on a charge of heresy. He was brought in on a charge of blasphemy. And he had to sit through several inquiries, and we don't know what happened. It's kind of a mystery. That anyone who tries to document what happened with Joachim Gans tries to research that, will find that it's very difficult to find out what happened to Gans after those events. We assume he wasn't trialed or burnt or executed, because that would have been quite a big thing in England at the time and we would have known about it. So the probably the likelihood is that they just made a bit of a fuss. Here's this blasphemous, ridiculous person, but who's a very, very useful industrialist, but he's or scientist, and he's helping us make gunpowder and he's helping us smelt metals, so we'll just let him be. But Joachim Gans is a first Jew in North America. A very interesting figure, and his own life shows the shifting, not only geographically but mentally and conceptually as well. His cousin David Gans is in Prague writing Jewish history, and at the same time at the Maharal, but Gans is waltzing around North America and England creating copper refineries and so on. Fascinating. And if we are on the subject of Jews going places, then what about the other direction? So you remember that we spoke about the fact that the Spanish and the Portuguese basically divided the world up. The Spanish went westward across the Atlantic, and the Portuguese went round Africa through to India and established communities in India. Well, hello. Who went with them? And who was part of that whole project? And many, many of the Portuguese settlers in India were Jews, some of whom even came out in India and said, yeah, like the Portuguese are going to get us here. So some of the foundations of the very complex picture that is going to form Indian Jewry and the foundations of the community at Cochin and at Bombay and so on are going to be made up of these Portuguese Jews that were coming in the wake of the whole Vasco da Gama discoveries and the establishment of the Portuguese colonies, particularly in Goa. And amongst them was a Portuguese Jew who outwardly was a converso, but we know that his family were quite seriously keeping the law of Moses, and his name was Garcia de Horta. And Garcia de Horta, if this entire lecture was just on Garcia de Horta, it would be amazing. You have to realize I'm touching on people that are astonishing. But Garcia de Horta was a doctor. And he basically... Sorry? Another one. So we had doctors going here, we had doctors going there, but like Moshe Hamon, Garcia de Horta was a very serious, high-level doctor. He became basically the Portuguese medical authority for all of the East Indies. But what is amazing about his career and what is amazing about his contribution is that when de Horta arrived in India, it became apparent to him after a while that the Indians themselves and the whole of the Eastern world had its own way of doing medicine. And different schools of medicine, some called things like Ayurvedic medicine and other forms of Eastern medicine. And de Horta had come with his 16th century trained classical European medical training. And he was the first person. Now it's very, very trendy. But 500 years ago, this was radical. He was the first person to attempt to synthesize these two fields of medicine, and he spent years exploring. He is the person who catalogued, illustrated, wrote about all of the Indian natural medicines, particularly the herbs and the plants, things that could be useful in medical situations, and started to try and get Europeans interested in them. And certainly for the population of Goa and the population of India itself to integrate the local medical knowledge into European medical knowledge, but also effected this tremendous synthesis between the two, a synthesis that is really part of an ongoing story. He's like the first Western naturopath. And what's amazing about Garcia Dorta, which by the way, he was given a house on an island just off Bombay. That house went on to become a very important part of Bombay, and in fact it was in that very house quite some time later where India was effectively handed over to the British. It played a very, very significant part. There's a whole municipal garden in Goa called the Garcia Dorta. It's the main municipal. I mean, we're talking like a major figure, not some a Jewish boy who did well. He's a major figure. The Portuguese have put out stamps about him, and so everybody's trying to claim Garcia Dorta is such a cool figure. Except at the time, when the Inquisition finally stuck its dirty fingers into Goa and into India, they discovered that Garcia Dorta's family had been observers of the law of Moses. They burnt his sister. After he survived for 2 or 3 years without the Inquisition getting to him, but they burnt his sister, and then they dug up his remains and burnt them. And they burnt all his books. The only books we have by Garcia Dorta are the ones that managed to get out of India. He set up his own printing press as well to print his books. And only because his books became translated very soon after in Europe do we have all of his works, well, the ones that we know of. Incalculable damage caused by the incredible evil of the Inquisition and the way it was directed against Jews. Jews, by the way, who constantly claimed that they were sincere. Many Jews actually were. Many Jews actually were. I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the most famous Jew of the 16th century. But before I do, I just need to talk about one more person who acts as a prelude to this. And when I talk about this person, some of you will go, oh, now I know who he means by the most famous Jew of the 16th century. Because I spoke about what was going on in Elizabethan England, and I can tell you that the most famous case of a converso in Elizabethan England was, of course, Rodrigo Lopez. Put up your hand if you know who I'm talking about. Oh no, this is good, this is good, this is good. I'm glad we're talking about this now, because you can't go to that dinner party and not know about Rodrigo Lopez. Rodrigo Lopez was converso from a family, a fairly observant family. When I say observant, I mean observant of the laws of Moses. And in fact got into some trouble for that in Spain. And then managed to get out of Spain eventually, it wasn't in Portugal, Spain, and make his way, Rodrigo Lopez, and made his way to England, where he was a doctor. He had studied, there you go, he had studied medicine in Spain. He had actually reached quite a high degree of professional respect, but the pressure on him to get out of Spain was too much. He fled from Spain, and he rocks up in England sometime maybe around the 1570s, maybe even a little earlier. By the 1580s, he's seriously set because, as so often happens, you become a good doctor for one celeb, you get passed on to another celeb, and by the 1580s, he was the celeb doctor of Elizabethan London. Everybody who had money or status wanted Roger Lopez, because he changed his name to Roger. He actually, on his graduation certificate in medicine, it's in Spain, it's actually written Ruy Lopez, but he's not related to the chess Ruy Lopez. But Roger Lopez was a very, very trendy, and like he was the doctor. And we don't know if he was. There are some who write actually about him. Some obviously people who didn't like him say he's not such a great doctor. The reason that he's so in demand is because he keeps telling people what a great doctor he is. So, you know, he had a good PR going. But eventually, and he also became, importantly, he became the doctor of the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and so on. And he's climbing up the food chain until eventually in the 1580s, he is appointed as the royal physician to Elizabeth I. Check that out. Moshe Hamon, royal physician, personal royal physician to Suleiman the Great. Rodrigo Lopez, personal royal physician to Elizabeth I. And then all the intrigue starts. Some people attribute it to the fact that he fell out with the Earl of Essex. The Earl of Essex, unfortunately for the Earl of Essex, had some pretty bad case of venereal disease, which Lopez was treating, and Lopez made the injudicious mistake of happening to mention this to some other people. This guy got back to the Earl of Essex. Oh, so-and-so told me you've got venereal disease. And that seriously annoyed the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, and he set about his downfall. But Lopez himself, if he was anything, it would appear from all the studies we have of his personality, was indiscreet. Was probably his biggest mistake. Because he then managed to get implicated, and because he had a bit of bravado and a bit of ambition, he thought he would get involved in some of the English-Spanish politics that was going on at the time, and it was not a time to get involved in that, especially if you were indiscreet. And he was a very, very easy target. And so eventually, in 1593, 1594, at a time really where Lopez was at his absolute peak. He had the Queen, he had noble men and women, he had all the celebs as his patients. He had a son who was at one of the great schools. He was respected. He was a member of the Church of England, even though people were saying he's really just a Spanish Jew and so on, but that was okay, it was overlooked. And then boom, it all came crashing down because they accused him of being involved in a plot to poison the Queen. Mm-hmm. He, of course, protested innocence, and it looks like on the face of it, especially since a few years later the Spanish came out and go, there was no plot and there was no Rodrigo Lopez involved in it. So he was kind of vindicated. It looked like he was kind of innocent of that, but he was probably guilty of being overly ambitious and indiscreet in his communications, thinking that he maybe was invulnerable. He probably was not plotting to kill the Queen. And even on the scaffold, he was hung, drawn and quartered. And even on the scaffold, he declared that his innocence, and he says, you know, I love Jesus, I love the Queen, but it didn't help. The crowd just mocked him and said, no, you're a Jew, go down. But the Lopez trial, and the Lopez trial went on for months and months and became the talking point of Elizabethan England. It was the big thing. The Queen herself held off on signing the decree of execution for about 3 months because she just couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe that Lopez was part of a plot to kill her, and she didn't want to do it, but whatever pressure was brought to bear, she eventually signed it. Knowing Elizabeth, she probably signed it just to get the problem over and done with so we could move on to something else. But she signed it and he was executed. On the day that Lopez was arrested, rehearsals began on a play by Christopher Marlowe called The Jew of Malta, which suddenly raised the profile of interest in the British public, after 300 years of never having actually met a Jew, of who are the Jews and what do they want? And why have they suddenly come to our attention? And within 2 years of that is the production of the most famous Jew of the 16th century, who is, of course, Shylock, the Merchant of Venice. Shylock and the whole complexity around the character of Shylock, and I grew up having long arguments with my father on this. The question of whether The Merchant of Venice is an anti-Semitic play. My father, who was a brilliant reader of Shakespeare, argued consistently that in his opinion The Merchant of Venice was not an anti-Semitic play. And I kind of agreed with him for many years, because it's not a popular opinion, and when you're young, you like to have opinions that aren't popular, especially if your dad has told you why. And then in my own research, I've come to realise that at the end of the day, with all due reference to Shakespeare, it kind of is. It kind of is. But the complexity of Shylock as a character and his position within the perception of the Jew in English society at the end of the Elizabethan age, which is really, we're only about half a century away now from the readmittance under Cromwell, or maybe 60, 70 years away from that, is nevertheless an indication about how once again the reach of Jews was such that they were forcing changes in the world. They were undeniable. If you look carefully also at the kind of theology underlying Shylock, you can see that Shakespeare is playing with many of the different themes. He's introducing the public. Shylock, as you know, is a much, much more complex figure than Marlowe's. So it's a totally different level of psychological complexity. But bear in mind that Shylock's speech that Shakespeare pens for him, you know, if you prick us, do we not bleed, and all the things, was also Shakespeare's dig at the ignorance and superstition and anti-Semitism, unwarranted anti-Semitism of English society itself. Shakespeare's play is a play about the fact that to be a Jew is a theological point of view, not necessarily a racial point of view. In a way, despite whatever anti-Semitic dimensions of the play it might have in its reception history, it is kind of a pointer towards a more enlightened view about Jews in many ways. We could obviously debate that for a long time, but there's no question that if there's one Jew that anyone's heard of from the 16th century, it would be Shylock. So that's where we got. But Shylock. The main thing I wanted to talk about tonight was the fact that Shylock, the Merchant of Venice, is and also the fact that it's in Venice. So Venice was kind of exotic for the British audiences and had that whole playoff as well. But the fact that and maybe Shylock was based on these kind of figures that Shakespeare might have heard about. But Shylock, the Rise of the Merchant of Venice as a play is almost inconceivable unless we understand in the context of the history of what has just happened with Rodrigo Lopez and so on in British society of the time. So that's where we've brought us to. We started a few weeks ago looking at Ovadio Mibartanura, of all people, who arrives in Jerusalem at the end of the 15th century and sets off a range of different things in motion. We looked at the year of repentance in the year 1500, and now we come right up to 1600, and we have a different world. We have a different world now, but the many, many Jewish actors that have been at the centre of the 16th century have seriously contributed to the creation of that new world, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about David Solomon's books, recordings and classes, or to support his work and teachings for just a few dollars a month, visit davidsolomon.online.